Thanks for turning up on a Thursday evening. I say desperately trying to remember which day of the week it is because I went to the Bat Conservation Trust National Bat Conference at the weekend and I'm still recovering. I said I would talk to you about all the guidance that's come out recently, and of course we had a flood of them back in last autumn. Probably caught a few people on the hop, but now you've had a whole year to get used to them being there. You can spend your winter reading them. There's about 500 pages altogether, so that's quite a lot to get through, and there isn't really a shortcut. You just need to read them and reread them, and even though I've read all of them several times, I do keep going back to them all the time as my aid memoir. So the Bat Mitigation Guidelines was probably the longest awaited because it was published in 2004, not updated since, so that was 19 years, pretty shocking. And the Bat Survey Guidance was 7 years in the remaking, longer than anyone on the technical review board thought it would take to get from version 3 to version 4. And the Lighting Guidance was 5 years. And there's more to come, which I'll talk about a bit later. So I'm going to talk about the Bat Survey Guidance first, not the detail of it, but some myths around survey guidance and what they're for. Then I'm going to use the Bat Mitigation Guidelines to help you get the most out of your project. And then I'm just going to give a nod to the Bats and Lighting Guidance because I wasn't involved in writing those and I'll run out of time. So let's start with the Bat Survey Guidance and the first myth, which is that the BSG states how much survey effort must be done in any circumstance. Well, that's not exactly true because the guidelines are guidelines and people do try to treat it as a recipe book, but one size doesn't fit all. What the BSG are trying to do is encourage you to determine the questions that need to be answered. So I'm not suggesting that you just go by gut feel, but you imagine yourself defending your approach at a public inquiry and satisfy yourself that you're able to robustly defend any departures from those guidelines. And when you start a project, think about the questions that you need to answer in order to do a decent impact assessment a little bit further down the line. Right, myth number 2, the BSG tells you what you should do in any circumstance. Well, that's also not true. Technology is rapidly changing, and I was very conscious of this at last year's Bat conference when Jan Collins stood up and proudly launched version 4 of the conference, and then up popped Jim Mulholland with his trail cameras, and they don't really figure very much in the BSG. But they really are something that we need to add into our repertoire, and there's a huge amount going on with thermal cameras. Some of you will have seen those videos on LinkedIn. And if you're not on LinkedIn, you should go on LinkedIn because there's loads of bat stuff on there. And we're working out ways of using them better so that we can mark the track of the bats through the sky, and we can work out which bit of the video we need to look at afterwards rather than looking at all of it. And we'll need to work out how to adopt those things for ourselves for now, because they're not really covered much in the 4th edition of survey guidance, and we're still waiting for the night vision aid guidance to come out. And by the way, if you haven't seen Jim Mulholland's footage of a squirrel versus a nocturnal, I urge you to look it out. Okay. Myth number 3, guideline level surveys will bankrupt the project. Well, that is actually not entirely a myth because it's not really designed for major projects. It's certainly not designed for large scale maintenance projects where you're not smashing stuff up, you're just fixing it and putting reefs back. So I think it's important to remember that there is a bit of a stab for large long running projects involving trees on table 6.5. And they're set out in that what you should do at different stages of the project. And we could definitely do with that a version of that for other types of projects. Until we do have that, it's back to making sure you can justify your approach. And I definitely, if you've got a big project and you want to go significantly away from the guidance because it really would be disproportionate, then I would talk to your LPA and try and talk to your SNCB as well, i.e. Natural England, NRW, etc., etc. And I said there's some more guidance coming. That's to do with large-scale maintenance re-roofing projects, but it's disappeared back into the SNCB black hole, so hopefully it will come out soon. certainly before the next field season. One of the specific examples that isn't covered very well is perhaps solar projects. They can be very large. They're often in largely arable habitats, not very in habitats that aren't very sympathetic to bats. And if you were to put them everywhere you might want to put them in an ideal world, you'd end up with a hugely disproportionate amount of data. That's really important from a carbon point of view as much as anything, because we are collecting masses of data already, even when it's proportionate, and that's all stacking up in these data servers globally. So we need to think about where we're going to put them and get representative samples. But the real key here is responsiveness. So once you've put your first set of statics out, you need to analyze results as soon as you can, and that will tell you if you need to do anything differently. So you might see there's a lot of activity somewhere where you don't expect it. So you want to go and ground truth that with manual surveys, or you might even find something you're not expecting. And then maybe in some samples, some situations, you might even want to go out and do some trapping. For example, if you think you might have grey long-eared bats, you might think that's unlikely on your typical solar site, but I'm working on an MOD site, which looks really uninspiring, but we have picked up a couple of calls which we think might be greys. So you never know. And just remember always that the guidelines allow for the application of professional judgment, but you need to show that your judgment is sound. Okay, myth number 4. My data is 2 years old, and I need to repeat everything. Also not true. It kind of depends why you're repeating the surveys, and that will depend on the status and phase of the project. So are you trying to show that nothing's changed because it's taken quite a long time to get to the point of writing the impact assessment? Or are you putting in a license application where some of the information needs to be up to date, but you need to think about which bits need to be more up to date? Or are you trying to confirm that bats are absent pre-demolition? All of these situations require a different approach. And it also, crucially, depends on the quality of what's been done before. Okay, myth number 5. This is possibly my least favorite. Buildings should be categorized as high, moderate, or low suitability, and then you need to do 3, 2, or 1 surveys. I have heard this so many times, even from people who should know a lot better. This level of effort is the recommended effort for presence-absence surveys to give confidence in a negative result for structures. Once you know you have bats, you need to go and do roost characterization surveys, unless you've already got enough information, which you probably haven't. That might take 1 more survey or several surveys, depending on likely use and your findings. Right, myth number 6. Using auto-ID is really 2 in 1. Using auto-ID is lazy, and it's better to do sound analysis by hand. And anyway, I need to do so much QA, it's not really worth it. Well, I completely disagree with that, because I am a big fan of auto-ID, and they are coming along nicely. Much better than they were back in 2013-14 when I started looking at these. It's true that an experienced person may, and I'll say may, be better than a machine, although they can get some inbuilt biases which make them think that they know better. But a less experienced person almost certainly isn't better than a machine, or not consistently as good as a machine. And the larger the volume of data you've got, and we are collecting masses of data, the less likely it is that a very experienced person will do all of it. That's just common sense. Nobody who's got a lot of experience is going to sit down and do loads of sound analysis, because let's face it, it's dull. The picture on the right is the front of a guidance note I produced a while ago with Stuart Neeson of the BTO pipeline, when the BTO pipeline was probably still a twinkle in his eye, and Kate Jones of UCL. And a lot of that information and good practice is now in version 4 of the BAT survey guidance. I would say that you do need to use good quality equipment. You need to test your microphones regularly. You need to set up your equipment correctly. Again, that's all in the BAT survey guidance. And when you're setting up your QA protocol, think about what you're trying to understand. The so what principles here. Does it matter if you've got 250 or 300 pipistrelles? What's the difference? What difference will it make to your outcomes and your assessment? So think about that. That so what principle is important, as it always is when you're defining your survey protocol and your survey effort. So as I've alluded to, all of these issues are in the BAT survey guidance. And sometimes when writing a new version, I thought, we should really put this in. And then I've gone back to look at the previous edition and thought, oh, it is in. It's just that no one's really paying attention. And the only real solution to avoiding these myths is to read the chapters as a whole and not cherry pick. Sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. Because a lot of people spend a lot of time, much of it unpaid, to get to this point. So I'm not sorry you have to spend your time reading it. And I really, really, really would encourage you to read it. Start at the beginning and read all the way through to the end, and then go and read it again. And then at different points in your career, keep going back to it and read it again. And remember, when you do want to deviate from the guidance, put the risk onto the client, get agreement from them, hopefully from the LPA ecologist and hopefully from your SNCB. Understand the risk of that. And again, I'd encourage you to imagine defending your approach to public inquiry, satisfy yourself and be able to robustly defend any departures. But it's absolutely true, and not a myth, that the BSG definitely doesn't cover every scenario. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about the BSG. I probably ad-libbed so much we're almost out of time, but not quite. I'm going to go on to the bat mitigation guidelines and what's in them. So hopefully some of you have looked at them already because they've been around for a year and are also a little bit familiar with the 2004 guidance. You'll hopefully have noticed there's much more of a rounded focus on developments in the 2023 guidance. We've given a method of valuing bat populations and assemblages, which not everybody likes, understandably, and we'll see how that comes out over the next year or few. There's guidance on legislation. There's guidance on assessing impacts on bats in quite some detail. Mitigation, obviously, because it's mitigation guidelines, but not just those. There's a little bit about enhancing development sites, but we all know that biodiversity net gain isn't really designed for species, and quite a lot on monitoring. And the other thing it has, and this is going to add to your reading, is signposts and links to published research and guidance. And there's also, because this is my pet project, I'm currently case supervising a PhD on bats and noise, it's got a lot of help with understanding bats and noise and how to collect data and interpret it. What's not in the guidance is repetition of that material and guidance elsewhere. So use the opportunity to follow the links and go and find it. Set yourself up with a long bath, some bubbles, glass of wine, and read some of those other documents that have been produced, some of it in the UK and some of it in Europe. And it hasn't got any survey guidance in it because, of course, that's all in the bat survey guidance. We don't have all the answers. And this is one reason why this talk is really appropriate for this group, because what we need is more evidence, which is why I'm going to come back to monitoring at the end. Right, legislation. Legislation is tricky. It's different in all 4 countries, and we just seem to like to make life complicated. Because it's tricky, it's often neglected, and people don't really understand it. There is a lot about legislation in the bat mitigation guidelines, and it's one of the bits I'm most proud of. It's not all my own work, and it did go through FREETS, and they put a lot of stuff back in that I then had to move out to an appendix because there's a lot in there. But what it does do is give you a bit of help on some of the grayer areas, particularly disturbance. Now, that's something the SNCBs are very reluctant to do because whenever they write something like that, it goes to their legal team and their legal team cross out all the bits of interpretation and just take it right back to the bare bones of the legislation. So there is more in there, and there's quite a lot of interpretation and helpful references to case law. And if you understand it a little bit more rather than treating it as a black book, I dare to say you might find it a bit more interesting. So we're going to have a quiz now because everyone loves a quiz, but it's anonymous, so you can be honest. I want you to read this text. You should be broadly familiar with it. But this has been produced by a report, in a report from a third party, picked up through the planning process. So I'd like you to read it, and then I'm going to ask you a question, and I will leave the text on the screen while you answer the question. So you don't need to scribble notes, you can just read it. I'll shut up for a minute. And then if we can have the first question up on the side. And if you could pick one of those. And then when we've got a decent number of answers in, perhaps we can put the answers up. Okay. Let's put up question 2. Oh no, if we got question 2, maybe I haven't got, sorry, I haven't got the extra text on the slide. Don't put the next question up. So it's incorrect. So quite a lot of you thought it's more or less correct, and some of you thought it was incorrect. Now, it's incorrect. And I'll tell you why, because we're talking about in England. That first offence, intentionally kill, injure, or take a bat, does not come under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And I know some of you are not going to believe me, but that offence appears under the Habitats Directive and therefore our habitats regulations in England. It is also not an offence to damage or destroy access to a bat roost under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. The offences under the Wildlife and Countryside Act are disturbing a bat in its roost, obstructing access to a bat roost, and also those things around possession and sale. Right, let's put up question 2. You're going to have to guess at this. Have a guess at when that change was made, when the Wildlife and Countryside Act was amended to remove those offences which were already adequately covered by the HABS regs. And again, if you can put the answers up once we've got a decent number of. No Googling. That would be cheating. Congratulations, those 5 people who said 2007. Well done. In 2007, there was a major revision of the habitats regs, and offences which applied to European protected species were taken out of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Okay, let's have question 3. Remember, this is the report which has come across my desk in the last few years. Incorrect. Right, let's put up question 4. And again, show the answers when we've got a reasonable number of answers. More of you got this right than wrong. Well done. It's 2017 as amended. Yes, there was something in 2019 talking about Brexit, but it didn't actually amend the regs. It just made them work outside of Europe. Now, if I'd asked this question in Scotland, the answer would have been 1994 as amended. So I hope that will encourage you to go and revisit the legislation, and you can do that easily by looking at chapter 2 of the guidelines. Right, so little sense check, a couple of extra little pointers for you to intrigue you into going to listen to more. So we've already discussed that only some parts of section 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act apply to EPS in England and Wales, because those offences are adequately covered under the HABS regs. However, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, they put all of the wildlife and countryside offences into the Habs regs, and the Wildlife and Countryside Act doesn't apply to European protected species in Scotland and Northern Ireland. I'm going to come back to that in 2 seconds. From the Environment Act in 2021, you can now issue licenses for development under the Wildlife and Countryside Act in England, but not in Wales. So they've now introduced a big difference between England and not in Wales. And if you've got a license under the Habitats regs in England, it covers you for offences under the Wildlife and Countryside Act in England, but not in Wales. That's good, or not. And then you may be signed up to licensing newsletters from Natural England. And if you don't receive those, I suggest you do sign up. And you'll have seen in July some references to notifications under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So that's related to that disturbance offence, which is only under the Wildlife and Countryside Act in England. And obviously this is a Natural England newsletter, so it only applies in England. And they have now decided in their wisdom that there are 4 levels of disturbance. One is negligible, one is low-level disturbance relating to that Wildlife and Countryside Act offence of disturbance of an animal in its place of shelter, i.e. a roost. One is licenses, which is a bit more than that, but falls under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And one is more serious disturbance, which falls under the Habitats regs. And that second level of disturbance, so it's kind of an incidental result of an otherwise unavoidable action, is what the notification process is for. Now, of interest to me, and I didn't notice this till I was writing the legislation section of the guidance, is that in 2007, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then England and Wales all went their own way, and England left some of their offences in the Wildlife and Countryside Act, as we've discussed, and Scotland and Northern Ireland pulled them all into their habitats regs. So England's habitats regs match what's in the directive, and Scotland and Northern Ireland don't. And that's important because in doing so, they changed that disturbance around affecting an animal's ability to hibernate, migrate, breed, etc., from animals, which case law suggests relates to the species, and an animal, which is what it is in the habitats regs in Scotland and Northern Ireland, which means the bar is different and case law is more difficult to apply. This is probably of esoteric interest unless you work in Northern Ireland or Scotland, but I think it's quite fascinating, which is why chapter 2, which is the legislation chapter, is quite so long. Right, let's move on to something a bit more practical. I think I've nagged you enough about legislation and hopefully have encouraged you to get a little bit more embedded and understand it a little bit more. So if we're going to do an impact assessment, we need to know how important is the thing that we're looking at. And that's been quite difficult to do. And it also varies depending on where you are in the country because species have different distributions. On the same side, we have, as part of the ECIA process, giving things geographical frames of reference of importance. So what we wanted to do is mimic that. And in the first stage of valuation, we have to decide where things are. So we've got 9 different regions now, which separate species according to how abundant they are in particular areas. So, for example, you'll notice that Northern Ireland and Northern Scotland have a much reduced suite of species, and also some of the species are in different categories as they are in somewhere like the Southwest, where you've got a lot of rarer species and they tend to be more common in a particular category. So wherever you're working for your project, you decide where you are in the country, and then you can decide which species fit those 4 categories on the left. Some people wanted a map. There are no maps. You'll have to use your judgment and local knowledge. There's a few extra pointers in version 1.1 that you might need to look at if you've only got version 1 of the Bat Mitigation Guidelines. But bats are on the move. If we wanted to make a map, we'd need 18 different maps. Coul's pipistrelle is moving all over the European continent, turning up in Scotland, turning up commonly on the south coast. There's been a barbastelle in Merseyside last year, There's a less horseshoe bat that's just turned up on Derbyshire, and actually that's on the borderline of the county boundary of South Yorkshire. So if we wanted to write a map, we probably have to change it every bloody week. So there are no maps, so don't ask for a map. Right, now you've valued your system. You need to know, now you've categorized your species, you need to value what it is. And so this has got your categories down the left and which species fits in which box depends on where you are in the country. And then across the top, you've got reefs. Now we tried to do this matrix approach for commuting areas. Commuting routes, linear features, it wasn't going to work. It was never going to work. So we've only got it for reefs, unfortunately, but there are lots of pointers to what might make something more or less interesting in terms of commuting routes and foraging habitats, and that also applies here. There are lots of caveats and modifying factors, so you might increase your importance if you've got something like an edge of brain species, and that's why there's more than one word in some of these boxes. It's also simplified for this presentation because I've taken out national just to make it easier, but obviously you've got a SSI or a SAC, you'd want to call that national. Importantly, it mirrors that SIEM ECIA process, so we've got those geographical levels of importance within the matrix. Okay. Now you've valued your receptors and you understand a little bit more about your projects, you need to define the impacts. We've put quite a lot of this in the guidance, and I think some people might think it's too complicated for the work that a lot of bat workers do, but the principles are the same, whatever the size of the project you're working on. You need to look at reefs, you need to look at foraging and commuting habitats. For some projects like roads and rail and wind farms, you're going to need to look at mortality. You're usually going to look outside the site boundary because bats are mobile and in all seasons because they do different things at different times of the year. And for those really bigger projects, you're going to need to look at things at all phases, not just construction impacts and operational impacts. So you're going to think about their end of life, particularly for things like solar farms and wind farms. And there might be some advanced works where they go and do site clearance or ground investigations. So you need to think about those as well. There's lots of help on that in the chapter 4. Then finally, we're going to get to mitigation. And I couldn't really talk about mitigation without talking about mitigation hierarchy, starting with avoid. I'm not going to go through this because you should all know, or you soon will if you're starting your career, what the mitigation hierarchy is, because you should be thinking about it for all of your projects. The avoid is really, really important. And you should always start with avoid. Obviously, in a mitigation hierarchy, that's the point of the hierarchy. But it's really important for bats because we don't understand how they find their compensation routes. So we might think it's a good idea to take away what they're using now and give them something else, but we're not always very good at giving them what they want, and they might not be very good at finding the thing that we've given them, even if it's better, in inverted commas, or we think it's better than what they had before. This is a proposed scale of mitigation, if you like. It's a proportionate level of mitigation in different circumstances. It's based on our previous experience of licensing, also on internal SNCB guidance notes where they were shared with me when I was writing this chapter. It's here because we wanted a degree of flexibility. We wanted to keep that SIEM ECIA methodology reflecting importance at different spatial scales. And those regional differences in distribution abundance are also accommodated as a result. Now, just sticking to this table won't guarantee that a mitigation proposal will be approved by the SNCBs. Every situation is different, and this is a very simple table, and you can't get all the elements in. And it's certainly not going to work so for a very long-running scheme with very large impacts. But it's a starting point. Right, I said how I was going to give you some help on getting the best out of your mitigation strategy. You can have the best mitigation strategy in the world, but if nobody knows about it and it's only in your head or in scribbles or on your bookshelf or indeed on the contractor's bookshelf, then it's not going to go anywhere and it's not going to work. So you need to make sure your messages are getting through to the people who need to know them. That might not necessarily be your immediate client contact. You need to share drawings at an early stage with the contractors doing the work on the ground, and they might be the ones who are costing it. And I had a client tell me recently, if you want something done, don't give it to me in a report, don't give it to me in a quote, put it on a drawing, and then I can give it to the guys, and then they'll tell me what I need to do. So drawings are good. Have meetings. Don't send excessively long emails to clients. They won't read them. So have meetings to explain the objectives, and then by all means, follow it up with your emails, your reports, and try and highlight the things that are most important. Remember that bat mitigation is sometimes seen as an obstacle. They want to get it done with, out the way quickly. They're thinking about other things. But doing that, if we don't stop them, can lead to costly mistakes that have to be rectified. And that's included, in my past, a contractor having to remove a new roof to change an unsuitable roofing membrane. They did have clear and timely instructions, but maybe just didn't give them to the right person. It wasn't necessarily my role to do that. But had I done that, it wouldn't have got to the point where they had to take the roof off. So that's worth knowing. Constraints like seasonal restrictions might be at the forefront of your mind, but they won't be at the forefront of theirs. So things that affect a program, or that they need to get their act together to do something in order for X, Y, and Z to happen afterwards, they need to understand that. They need to understand the longer term requirements, because some measures can take several years to establish, particularly if you're looking at habitat creation and enhancement. And always, always make comprehensive records. Photographs are invaluable. And if you're thinking in future of going through the earned recognition system, this will really stand you in good stead, because you will be able to demonstrate that you were there and that you made good decisions. So keep those records and keep those photographs coming. But remember overall that it's your job to give pragmatic and reasonable advice and not to ask for the impossible. I have seen some reports, scenarios, which suggest that if the client did everything and didn't have an understanding of what was really important, what was critical, what was nice to have, what they could have done, bit enhancement, then they'd have had one Thursday in October to do everything. So make sure that your advice is pragmatic. Here's a few more principles, perhaps relating more to the early stages of work, such as demolition or re-roofing. Remember that things don't always go to plan. Materials arrive late, contractors are late, licenses, dare I say, arrive late. You might need to be creative. Bats can be anywhere, but they're not everywhere. You need to base your mitigation decisions, practice on evidence rather than doctrine. That is difficult to get across sometimes. I've seen bad decisions where people have just said, you can't, and they've resulted in huge costs, program delays, significant knock-on costs and impacts, contractors sent off site without pay. That's really unfair. Huge grants almost lost, like grants in the hundreds of thousands, even when clients have done all the right things. That's not proportionate, and the negative PR should not be underestimated. So our job is to try and make things happen. I don't mean at all costs. I mean a good way of getting to your end point without an offence. Use evidence to guide your decisions. And then monitor, monitor, monitor. I can't say this enough. There's more focus on monitoring in this, the mitigation, because there's a wide consensus. And here we are in a group which is looking for evidence. There's a wide consensus that monitoring is incomplete, inadequate, and poorly reported even when it's successful. And we really need to build the evidence base of what works and what doesn't work. By doing that, we reduce impacts on bats, improve outcomes, and avoid white elephants, because they give a really bad conservation message. So the first stage is to make sure that everything that should be in place is in place, and that you're compliant with your licenses, your planning conditions. You might need to involve other disciplines such as lighting engineers or landscape architects, and everyone should understand what they're doing as part of that. And then the second stage is testing success, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. You might need to collect data specifically for the purpose of monitoring, so you've got something to compare with, even pre-construction. So remember that too. I'm not talking here about the checks you do as part of works like pre-felling, demolition inspections. You'll also need to do those. But this is really about post-development monitoring to make sure that we're learning from what we're doing and doing the right things. So every mitigation scheme, even if it's small, should be supported by a monitoring strategy, however brief. And in that, you should decide who's responsible for making sure the monitoring's done, who's going to pay for it, how, when, and where it will be done, how you're going to get access in the longer term, because that can be really hard when contractors leave site and sell on properties. I can't tell you how many people offer me case studies for the Bat Mitigation Guidelines, and I'd go, did you monitor? And they go, no, I couldn't get back on site. Not helpful, couldn't include it. Think about where the results need to go, but really importantly, make sure you understand who's going to be responsible for fixing anything that isn't right. And that funding can be really contentious, particularly for long-running projects. In the last few years of aftercare, everyone's moved off and the monitoring still needs to happen. Can be tricky. So ideally get those funds secured and ring-fenced up front. One of the examples in the Bat Mitigation Guidelines, one of the later ones, Wall Park, we had it tied up with a Section 106 agreement, and the party doing the farming with organic cattle had funds tied up for 10 years in order to get that done. Okay. I think I've covered everything now. Just a reminder that you need to know who's going to be responsible for those remedial measures. So we need to clearly define our objectives when we set up our monitoring strategy. We need to define success for each objective. I'm going to show you some in a minute. We're going to use proportionate appropriate methods for data collection. Don't go bonkers. We're going to outline thresholds for remedial action. When should we jump into action? And what will that action likely be? And then, because it's important to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and making sure we do it better next time, we need to contribute to a wider understanding of the measures that we've applied by making those results public where we can. So let's explain a little bit more about setting objectives and why they're important. I think let's look at this table just to get you oriented. The first column is the objective, the second is the test, and the third is the trigger for remedial action. And in the past, we've sometimes defined success rather loosely. So we've built compensation roost, it looks marvelous, and we found one dropping and we've gone, hooray, the bats have found it. So that's successful, right? But is it enough if a maternity roost has been lost? And does that tell us if we're getting it right? So to be sure we've mitigated adequately, we need to set objectives which are determined by the nature of the impact. And don't get me wrong, if it's a small and infrequently occupied roost, day rooster pipistrelles, access tile, you're probably not going to even monitor, because if a bat doesn't come out of it, that doesn't really tell you anything because they're infrequently used. That's the point. But if you're losing maternity roost, you want these two objectives at least. So the compensation roost has been used by the same species of bats using the roost for the same function. You've got a maternity roost, you want a maternity roost. You're going to look for evidence of species status and numbers at the relevant time of year, standard techniques. You want the same species, obviously. You might not get the same species back, but that's what you're aiming for. Do you need to do anything? Well, maybe not, as long as everything is implemented as intended. Everything that you wanted to do is there or better, and you've got the appropriate temperature regime in place. Now that leads you to the second objective. So compensation roost, is providing an acceptable range of temperatures. That's why you need temperature log data, ideally compared to the measurements in the original roost. If you've got areas in the roof which are providing the right temperatures, then again, maybe you don't need to do anything. But if you find your roost is much cooler than you expected, maybe you need to put in a hot box or something, or draft excluder or something which will help. And I would say that I think a very broad range of microenvironments within your roof space, if you've got the space to do that, is possibly one of the more critical things. I mentioned a little bit about noise at the beginning. I'm really, really excited by this. When I was working on High Speed 2, we had the opportunity to do some proper unweighted noise measurements. Now, unweighted means it's not targeted to the human ear. Normally, the measurements we take are targeted to the human ear, and we stop recording after 20 kilohertz because no one cares. And in fact, I went to do a hearing test the other day, and they tested up to 8 kilohertz because that's the area up to 8 kilohertz that people are most interested in. So you can see there's not much similarity between what bats can hear and what we can hear. You wouldn't understand that already because of echolocation. So what we did was we went out on site and we, acousticians, measured different sorts of activities at 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 meters, as close as they could get to for health and safety reasons, and then walking backwards, and did these lovely measurements so we can see what the different decibels on the y-axis are against different frequency bands on the x-axis, and every color is a different distance from the activity. I'm not going to talk much more about this, but there's a bit more help with that in the Bat Mitigation Guidelines. I normally do a workshop now at the National Bat Conference, and I'm talking to Simon and BCT about doing a workshop on this subject as well. So I won't say any more about that now. I'm just going to make a small nod to bats and artificial lighting. As I said, I wasn't involved in writing this, so I'm just going to throw some random points for consideration, which is, in a lot of circumstances, you'll probably need to get a lighting professional on board. They need to do lighting assessments on the vertical plane, not just the horizontal plane, because maybe your lighting is going to heavily light, say, a linear corridor that you want to keep dark. Low level lighting doesn't always work because it can cause a lot of glare, and taller lights can be more controllable. Low level lights are often subject to vandalism as well. When you get a model from lighting engineers, they might model the contribution of your new lighting scheme and not actually think about what's there already and what the whole thing will look like. And don't forget lighting from headlines. That's a really random selection, but it's all you're going to get from me tonight. Here's some links to guidance. I think this has been recorded, so you can get hold of this afterwards. So there's the Bat Survey guidance. The second link is a Q&A session that BCT did that I helped with, talking through some of the issues that people had with interpretation, and those discussions were finalized into this Q&A document. I don't think the recordings of the discussions are available, but the outcome is UK Bat Mitigation Guidelines, obviously UK lighting guidance. There's a link to that auto ID software paper that I talked about, although it's a little old because it's from 2016. And then look out for those large-scale reefing projects guidance, which is going to come out at some point. And that's me. I have no idea how long that was, but it's a little bit longer than when I practiced it, is what I'm going to say. I'm done.
Well, we